Hi, ladies. Welcome to the Art of Reframing. Today, we're going to talk about emotional flooding. I'm going to share with you how to swim and not sink when you feel overcome by another's emotions. That's right. I'm going to teach you how to build the ark because you can't control whether someone emotionally floods all over you, but you can choose your response. Let's get started. So, what exactly is emotional flooding and what can you do? So, if you've worked with me before or you've read anything that I've done, you know that I'm very staunch about this. You are responsible for your own words and actions, but you're not responsible for someone else's response to you. And so you are not responsible if someone emotionally floods all over you, but you can choose how you're going to respond. So, what exactly is emotional flooding? So, if you've done any research on relational dynamics, you've probably come across Dr. John Gottman. Dr. John Gottman is an expert in the field of relationships, and he first coined emotional flooding as the surge of emotions that takes away reason and thoughtful communication. So, ladies, bear with me here. Have you been on the receiving end where you're having a lovely day with your spouse? You're laughing. Maybe you're up in the morning making breakfast, talking about your day, and you have all these plans. Or maybe you're sitting on the couch and you're getting ready to watch a movie, and there's something that you have to share with your husband. And you're like, okay, things are going really well. I'm going to just mention this to him because I think he needs to know, right? Let's say you have a rule in your house that chores have to get done before electronics. And so you simply say to your husband, like, hey, babe, I just wanted to let you know that when I got home from work today, Bobby was on his gaming system and he hadn't done his chores. You're just simply sharing. You might have an expectation in there that you want him to do something. And his like mad about you in lovey dovey goes from that to mad at you. And he starts labeling you and accusing you of micromanaging or how do you really know he didn't do his chore? And a simple information relay on your part becomes an emotional flood, and the plans you had for the rest of the day are probably not going to happen, or they feel ruined in your mind. Maybe you take your corners and you don't talk much the rest of the day, but you're kind of left thinking like, what just happened? What did I do wrong? And friends, you didn't do anything wrong. You just experienced an emotional flood. So before we really dive in, I just want to take a few seconds to introduce myself. If you haven't worked with me before, or even if you had, my name is Heather Hetchler, and I am a certified reframing mindset coach and a seasoned stepmom expert. I've been ministering to stepmoms since 2009. And I like to say that I got my bachelor's in communications, which is true, my master's in communications research, which is true, my certification in life coaching, which is also true, and my PhD from the School of Stepfamily Hard Knocks, which is also true. And I am passionate about educating women on the complexities of stepfamily life and teaching them how to frame their relationships and the people through the lens of God so that they can experience it in a whole new way. I love providing the roadmap that I wish I would have had back in 2007 when my husband and I blended our families together. And that is my passion and that is my purpose. And that's why I'm sharing with you today on emotional flooding. It's something that so many couples are experiencing and we're not talking about. So on the agenda for today, how is emotional flooding showing up in your step family? We're going to talk about that. How to identify emotional flooding. What's your role in emotional flooding? What do you do when your spouse emotionally floods? How do you build that arc? I'm going to share with you some free phrases and resources that you can use in the moment. And then what are some next steps? So I want to dive right in and get going here. So how does emotional flooding show up in your marriage? And so for the sake of this workshop, I'm going to be giving examples and talking about when your spouse emotionally floods. Now, maybe you're the one that emotionally floods. Maybe your stepkids emotionally flood. Maybe their mom emotionally floods. Maybe your mother-in-law emotionally floods. Maybe your coworker does. But for the sake of this workshop, we're going to be focused on the marriage and how emotionally flooding shows up there. So looking at this picture, you might be able to relate. This couple's probably sitting on the couch, getting ready for the weekend. She thinks it's safe to share something about his child or something that happened with the ex, and it doesn't go the way she planned. And she's left blaming herself and beating herself up. And her husband is just kind of in his nothing box. He's taking space from the triggering things where he's triggered the emotional flooding, or he's maybe saying things and trying to end the conversation that way. But it's important to note that a step family dynamic does not cause a person to emotionally flood. However, the complexities and the dynamics of the remarriage with kids can create opportunities for your spouse to be more readily flooded. And so whether you are the one that emotionally floods or your spouse emotionally floods, both of you are impacted. So how to identify emotional flooding in your spouse? And before I start, and there's nine kind of telltale signs. I want to tell you this. As we're going through these 9 signs, you're probably going to hear some things and you're like, that's my husband, that's my husband, that's my husband. Okay. This information today in this workshop is for you. This is for you to identify when emotional flooding is happening so you can remove yourself from the flood, so you can build the ark, so you can ride the waves. This is not for you to go and tell your husband, now I know why you can't handle difficult conversations. Now I know what happens. We're going to get to that point, but first you have to lead. You have to learn the signs to remove yourself from the tumultuous seas and the waves that come crashing up on you. Okay? The second thing, and the second goal in teaching this, is for you to have compassion for your husband. So often when a man emotionally floods, 2 things happen. Either he abruptly ends the conversation, storms off, and walks away, and the wife is left feeling like she's been maybe abandoned. She's not important enough for him to stay and work through things. He doesn't understand her. He would never walk out of there because it's triggering her fear of abandonment. He doesn't care. That's not true. Your husband is most likely taking space from the triggering word, phrase, situation. He wants the physiological experience of emotional flooding to end. He doesn't want the conversation going on anymore. He doesn't like how he feels, and he's trying to get it to end, so he's trying to take space. Or your husband might, quote unquote, kind of explode emotionally, where he starts labeling you, and instead of sticking to the facts, he makes it personal. He's trying to get you to end your part of the conversation because he is trying to end him feeling emotionally flooded. This is something that overtakes someone. Now, this explains the behavior. It doesn't excuse it. But when you understand that your husband is not doing this because he doesn't care, because he doesn't love you, you can have a different experience with this. And you can be more clear-headed on how you respond. Because ladies, I want to tell you something. This explains it. It doesn't excuse it. But your husband can love you and not agree with you. Your husband can respect you and take space. Your husband can love you and want to work with you and walk out of the room when he's feeling emotionally flooded. Okay? I want you to keep that in mind. So here's one of the first ones, and this is a pretty telltale one. Intense emotional reactions. So these individuals are prone to emotional, just an intense experience. They feel overwhelmed in response to a particular stress, person, a triggering situation. So even looking at this picture, like let's say you're having a conversation and you're giving information only about his kid. And it's just all of a sudden he's overwhelmed. He can't think, and it just has this intense emotional reaction to the information that you're giving. Difficulty regulating emotions. Ladies, you know your husband well, and he may have difficulty regulating his emotions. That's not good or bad. That's not right or wrong. It is what it is. And we have to meet people where they are. We have to stop labeling things as good or bad, right or wrong, and meeting them. And so if he has difficulty controlling his emotions, that most likely will lead to a heightened emotional experience, which leads to emotional flooding. The next is physical symptoms. Somebody who's emotionally flooding typically has some emotional symptoms. Their heart starts racing, their hands get sweaty, they might start pacing, they might start, touching their head. They have a physical, because the emotional flood is a physiological response. It starts to flood their body, their brain, their heart. And so they're going to have some physical symptoms. inability to think clearly. This is one of the reasons that you are going to be motivated to take yourself out of a conversation that is being emotionally flooded, because the reason you're having the conversation, most likely, if it's an issue-based conversation, if you're bringing information to your husband, is because you want to come to a resolution. You want to have a solution. When the other person is unable to think clearly, you will not come to a resolution. You will not come to a solution. And so continuing that conversation will get you nowhere but frustrated. When someone is emotionally flooded, they are most likely incapable of thinking clearly. This is not a choice they are making. This is what the emotional flooding does to their cognitive functions. Someone who tends to avoid conflict. If your husband is prone to emotional flooding, it's often because they like to avoid conflict on a particular topic. So if you notice that your husband never wants to talk about things about his kids, or he doesn't want to talk about the ex, or he doesn't want to talk about certain things, it's probably because he knows subconsciously that that topic is connected to an emotional flood, and he doesn't like feeling that way. Men don't like feeling like they can't make a decision, that they can't control what words they say. They don't like it. And so if he can avoid topics, he can avoid the emotional flooding. He's not avoiding you. He's avoiding what happens to himself when he talks on that topic. Okay. Lastly, on this page, difficulty in expressing their needs. Once again, not right or wrong, not good or bad. But if your spouse has difficulty in expressing their needs, then they are probably more prone to emotionally flooding because they cannot articulate what they need. And so I'm going to pause here and share a story. It's actually a combination of a lot of stories. So I do a lot of coaching with stepmoms and couples. And this is a hot topic. That's why I'm doing this workshop on emotional flooding. And so oftentimes, if you've got especially a spouse who he's unable to think clearly when he gets emotionally flooded, he wants to avoid the conversation going any further. And so he walks out of the room. Abruptly, he leaves. And the wife is feeling like, he doesn't love me. He doesn't care. He doesn't want to work through this. He doesn't want to hear me. And she starts to chase him. And so the husband's like, I'm just trying to take some space. And, she just follows me from room to room. And the wife is thinking, and this is a combination of like the clients, right? This is a common theme. The wife is like, but I feel like if he only knew my heart, if he only knew why I'm bringing this up, if he only knew, he wouldn't be mad at me. And I don't want him mad at me. Well, it's okay for your husband to love you and be upset with you. Love and frustration can coexist. But he's incapable of thinking clearly. He's trying to take space from you. And oftentimes the wife's like, well, but hon, can't you just tell me, like, I need space. I need an hour. I'll come back to you. And most husbands say this. No, I can't even ask for that. I can't say anything. I'm afraid if I open my mouth, I'm going to say something that I will regret. So the wife is desiring him to just verbally say, I'll come back to center. And he's like, if I could say that, I could continue the conversation. I can't say anything. I just can't. You have to trust me that I'm walking away to preserve our relationship and to process on my own. Difficulty in expressing needs. And lastly, quick escalation of emotions. So emotional flooding often involves just a high escalation of emotions. This is where, like, something trivial, like, okay, you're bringing the fact that your stepson didn't do his chores. You're thinking, no big deal. And it just gets this huge emotional reaction. That's a sign that your spouse is most likely emotionally flooded. Past trauma or emotional wounding. Friends, you did not wound or cause the past trauma that your husband may have, and he may have healed from it, but there may be things that trigger it, and something in the present triggers something from the past, and it emotionally floods him. Give him the space and grace to process that. And friends, this goes into the last one, which is sensitive to criticism. Once again, not right or wrong, not good or bad. But if you know your spouse is sensitive to criticism, if you know it's really important for your husband to feel like he's winning, that he doesn't want to fail you, even when you're sharing information for information's sake, he may hear it as a criticism, and that can cause emotional flooding for him. Especially for men that were raised in a home where maybe their father was very critical and their mother was not. Their mother only encouraged and never challenged their son, never gave them constructive feedback. They see that as the role of the mom, as the role of the wife, because they never saw their mom challenge their dad. That may be what they think they should get from you, or they're not prepared to have those conversations with you. And so many men struggle with guilt of divorce, of their kids making poor choices. And I can't tell you how many husbands who have shared with me that they sometimes think that their wife, the stepmom, knows their kids better than they do. And there's a sadness and a guilt there. Like, why did I miss that? They're a better parent to my kids than I am. And that can cause, and especially if they're sensitive to criticism or they've had some past trauma or emotional wounding, that can be really difficult for them and a cause for them to emotionally flood on topics related to their kids. So what is your role in emotional flooding? Well, I am glad you asked. Now that you know how to recognize emotional flooding, you can remove yourself from the conversation. That's your role, to not participate in the escalation of the emotional flooding. So here's where I'm going to share some information with you. And if you've been in my small groups, I'm going to apologize because you've heard this before, but it's worth repeating. There are two types of conversations: issue-based conversations and emotional conversations, and never the two shall meet. Issue-based conversations need to stay issue-based, and emotional conversations need to stay emotional-based. So what I mean by that is, if you're bringing an issue to someone and they respond with an issue, like they stay on the facts, then you can problem solve and you can come to center and you can come to a resolution, or you can agree to disagree. But if you bring an issue or a fact and somebody responds with an emotion and they start labeling you, they're not problem solving. They're emotionally flooding you. And what happens? You tend then to want to defend yourself. Well, no, I'm not like that. And then you defend yourself. And then they tell you that you are. And before you know it, you're both wounded. You're both hurt. You're both in your separate corners. And you don't even remember what started the conversation. And you certainly don't have a solution for it. So let's go back to our example. You bring an issue. Hey, babe, I noticed that when I got home from work, Bobby was on his gaming system, but he hadn't done his chores. I just wanted to let you know and see how you wanted to handle that. An issue. The emotion, you're flooding. Oh my gosh, how do you know he didn't do his chore? Maybe he didn't do it up to your standards? Or, gosh, you always love bringing bad news about my son to me. Or, let me guess, your kids did their chores and mine didn't. They're not responding with the issue, like they're responding with an emotion. And you can see where that can go off. In that case, you can see that your spouse is responding to an issue with an emotion. That's when you can play your role and say, hey, babe, I'm bringing an issue to you. Sounds like this is frustrating. So I'm going to put a pause on this conversation. And you know what? I can circle back with you later. Or, you know what? I gave you the information that I wanted to give with you. You don't need to give me a response. Just wanted you to know that your son hadn't done his chores. That's all. And you excuse yourself and you build the ARK. And that's what we're going to talk about next. And then, because in emotional conversations where you might ask somebody, like, I just want you to listen to me. I just want you to hear how hard things have been. And then they respond with an issue or a fact proving to you that it hasn't been that hard. You don't feel validated. You don't feel heard. So then you try and explain yourself. That's a sign that someone is emotionally flooding, and it's not safe to share your emotions in that situation. And that doesn't mean that the person doesn't care about you. It's just a sign that in that moment, it's not wise to continue the conversation. And we can love our spouses and not always be on 100%. But when we can recognize when our spouse is emotionally flooding, and we can remove ourselves, and we cannot chase the space they're taking, and we can learn that ending the conversation before things are said and things get personal is wise and a blessing for ourselves and our marriage, that is good stuff. Okay, so when your spouse emotionally floods, like in that picture, see that physical sign, you're going to recognize the signs. You're going to recognize when you're bringing an issue and they're responding with an emotion. That's a sign that you're going to put the boundary in. You're going to use one of the phrases that I'm going to share next. You're going to end your part of the conversation. Doesn't mean that you're ending the conversation totally, but you recognize that the conversation will not come to a resolution when the other person is emotionally challenged right now. And then you're going to participate in your timeout system, which you're going to build. A timeout system is something that you can do so that you don't sit there and ruminate about what just happened. So you don't sit there and blame yourself and ask, how could I have said it differently? What could I have done? So that you don't go chasing the space if your spouse is someone who walks, right? Because we have fight or flight. So our spouse is either going to take space and walk away when he's emotionally flooded, or he's going to stay and fight and probably say things that he should not be saying, okay? And when you think about developing your timeout system, you want to pick something that engages your head and your hands. The more you engage your head with your hands, like figuring out how to do something, the less likely you are to ruminate. So you could do an exercise, you could cook, you could even do chores like housework. You put some music on and sweep, or go through some things, clean out a drawer. You could do a craft, but do something that's going to engage your head and your heart and your body. Okay, here is the building of the ARK. I love this acronym that I came up with because this is what you can do. Now, anchor, reflect, keep calm. We know that emotional flooding is a physiological response to stress. Okay, it overcomes the person. So we have to anchor ourselves and calm our body first. And you can do this in the conversation too. You're like, I just need a second. Put your hands on your knees and you can do this with me right now. I just want you to take in 3 deep breaths. And you'll just notice that your body is starting to calm down. You can also do some tapping, okay? And tapping, you can do tapping whenever. And I encourage you trying tapping. You can do it in your pocket. You can do it with your hands down at your sides. But you are trying to actually ground your body, okay? You're going to anchor. You're going to lower your stress, your physical response, because what happens when you bring an issue and your spouse brings an emotion, you feel this need to defend yourself. You feel a lot of things going on, like you're being misread. They don't care. I mean, name it. You're going through something too. So you want to anchor yourself and calm yourself. Then as you're sitting there and you've taken your space, and this is where we're going to talk about, like after the anchor is where you're going to excuse yourself from the conversation. Okay. And then you're going to sit and you're going to reflect. You're going to ask yourself questions like, what am I feeling right now? And ladies, for those of you that have done my small group mentoring, this is the soul scrub part. This is where we're going to get real with ourselves. This is where you're going to say, what am I feeling? Am I angry because, here we go again. I can't say anything right. Are you frustrated? Like, no matter what I try, it's like, we can't deal with what's going on with your child. Are you sad that this is the state of where you are? Be real with yourself. You can't work on something that you're not real about. So there is no right or wrong emotion. Be real about how you're feeling. And then ask yourself too, why is this so upsetting? Why is it so upsetting that he has a flight response, that he just walks out of the room? Maybe it's because it touches a fear of abandonment for you. Maybe you've been left in a prior relationship or a prior marriage. Maybe you've made to feel like you don't matter. And when he walks out, it makes you feel like he doesn't matter too. But I'm telling you, he may be walking out because you do matter. And him walking out is an illustration of his flight response to emotional flooding. It is about him, not about you. You are receiving, and you are on the receiving end of that emotional flood. That's why you're going to anchor yourself. And you're going to reflect, and you can say, you know what? It is really hard for me when he walks out of the room, but I'm not going to chase his space. I love him. His walking out is not a sign that I don't matter, that I'm not important, that I'm not loved, and I'm going to work on me. And if your husband is somebody who actually does the fight, or maybe he turns it emotional and starts labeling you, you're going to take yourself out of the conversation. You're going to remind yourself, you know what? I am not what he says I am. I do love those kids. I am trying. I am worthy. I am a daughter from the King. He is frustrated, and I will not own those words. And you're going to repeat that to yourself. And then you're going to continue to keep calm. You're going to maintain your emotional composure. That may be a process of your anchoring, where you're just going to do some deep breathing, but also bring in that built-in timeout system that you've already put together. So you don't have to think about what you're going to do. You're going to build this timeout system now, so that when this emotional flood happens, because if you've been on the receiving end, chances are it's going to come again, that you have it in place and you can go to your timeout system. This is going to play out in your marriage, in your stepkids, and with the ex-spouse. But you can build the ark and you can ride the waves and you can learn to swim above instead of being overwhelmed with the emotion. And you can stop ruminating and asking yourself, what am I doing wrong? Because you're not doing anything wrong, but you need to learn to pull yourself out of an emotionally flooded conversation. So here are some phrases that you can use, and I'm just going to walk you through them. So let's say you're having a conversation, you're bringing an issue up, you want to have some resolution, you want to just give him information, you want to be able to talk about something, but it's clear that he's emotionally flooded. That's something that he's experiencing. It's a physiological response. We talked about those 9 reasons. Has nothing to do with you personally. And here's some things that you can use to end your part. Hey, babe, I love you more than any conflict that we're ever going to have. So I'm taking a pause and we can reconnect later. And you might even want to give him a kiss on the cheek as you exit the room. I hear how frustrated you are. Let's just pause our conversation so we can come back after we've both taken some time to reflect and pray. Hun, I care about you deeply and I want us to have a productive conversation. Let's just pause for now and come back when we're both in a better place to discuss it. I want to support you through this, and I can see that this is a lot for you to process at the moment. I don't take any pleasure in giving you this information, but I need to take some time and reconvene. We're both ready to talk things through and stick to the issue. And lastly, honey, I respect you and I see how hard this is. I'm sharing information only right now, and I'm unwilling to continue my part in this conversation if I'm going to be falsely labeled. I'm pausing my part in this conversation, and I will come back later to finish our discussion. But for now, I want to hear you, and I can't hear you when you label me. This is if your husband emotionally floods and has that fight reflex where he's becoming emotional and he's blaming you. If you have a spouse that takes space, I want you to let your husband take the space. I know it can be hard because I know it may be triggering abandonment for you. I know it may be triggering lies of the enemy, that you're not worth it, that he's not going to stay and work through something with you. But I'm telling you, his walking away is about him and not you. Do not chase the space. Give him space. Go and take that timeout system. Go and do something to engage yourself. Remind yourself of who you are in Christ. Remind yourself of the truths, that this is about him taking space. I guarantee you, the more you change your response, when you stop chasing, he will notice that and he will be left with himself. He can no longer then, even say, well, you're chasing me, and focus on what your behavior is. He's left with his thoughts and his actions.